Good evening everyone, and thank you for attending the Railway Cinema Night. I thought I would shock my fellow speakers by dressing for the occasion without warning them. I'm Noel Dolphin from Throw and Fray, and I wanted to say a few words about this evening. However, I appreciate you're not here to see me, but Michael Portillo in the film, so I will keep my segment short. I want to cover three things. Firstly, give you an outline of the plan for tonight. Secondly, give you an idea of why we're here. And finally, talk about the modern use of the railway and public transport before we delve into its history. Firstly, the agenda for tonight. I'll soon hand over to Michael Portillo, who will cover some of the history of Great Western and the regional railways that connect to it. I think Michael is famous for his railway anecdotes, both modern and historical, so I'm greatly looking forward to it. Following Michael, we'll be playing the film Under the River. This short documentary is just under 30 minutes long. Filmed in 1959 by British Transport Films, it captures 7 tunnels' complex construction, the vital rail link between England and Wales. The mainline electrification between Cardiff and London was finally fully completed last year when Severn Tunnel went live. I saw this film shortly after the tunnel was electrified, and having worked in Severn Tunnel, I can understand what a complex and challenging environment it can be. And the film really helps the viewer grasp that. I want to thank the British Film Institute's National Archive for allowing us to play it here tonight. Following the film, there'll be a question and answer session, so if you have a burning question raised by the film or something you've always wanted to ask Michael about the filming of railway journeys, this is your opportunity to do so. Just enter your question in the chat box and we will attempt to answer them all. The second point I want to cover is why we're here. We've always hosted a transport themed event as part of Wales Week, and please check out their website for other events. In a COVID world, we thought, should we host one this year or hold off for a year? In the end, we compromised. We usually focus on contemporary public transport projects, but this year I want to do something different. With the completion of Great Western electrification and modernisation, it seemed an appropriate time to look back. The other reason we wanted to host an event was to support the Railway Benefit Fund. The Railway Benefit Fund supports railway people and their families in time of need. During the past year, the challenges have grown, and on average, someone reaches out in the railway family to RBF every 7 minutes. To support them this year, they're hosting Railway Family Week at the end of April, and I hope to raise £1,858 for them by the time of Railway Family Week. Why 1858? It's the year of their founding. Also the year the SS Great Eastern, Brunel's biggest ship, was launched. Why Railway Family Week? Well, in this year of lockdown, 1,000 families have reached out for support with equipment for homeschooling. 600 families have needed help paying the rent or mortgage. Everything helps, so if you can afford it, please donate just £2 for attending tonight. Please click on the donate button below. This will connect you to the Just Giving page. If you can afford more, £18.58 pays for lunches for a week for a child. I would hugely appreciate it, as would RBF. The third and final thing I want to say before handing over to Michael, I want to mention the modern use of the railway and public transport before we delve into the history. I'm sure you are here because you like trains, not only because of the engineering, but because they connect people, connecting them to work, education, leisure, healthcare, but also do so in a sustainable way. The electrification and modernisation of Great Western has made some significant changes. Firstly, as someone interested in electrification, this one project has increased the proportion of the UK railway electrified by 8%. For the environment, in electric mode, the trains reduce CO2 emissions by 60% immediately. As the UK electricity grid moves to renewables, this will increase further, so they become genuinely zero-emission vehicles. For the first time in a 167-year history of Paddington Station, the fumes are below the levels considered hazardous for health. For people passing through the station, this might not be a big thing, but for people who work there it is. However, we see the most significant changes for passengers. The new intercity trains have 46% more seats than the HSTs that they replaced. Those who commute to school or work and stood on a train will have seen the difference. Journey times are shortened. Swansea to London decreased by 24 minutes. However, it could have decreased further, but to increase the reliability and resilience of the line, the trains are not running as fast as possible to allow for recovery during disruption. That resilience has many facets. An electric intercity train can reach 125 miles an hour in 5 miles from stationary, compared to 15 miles from the trains they replace. This means dramatically faster recovery. It also means in places like Paddington reduced headway. The distance between trains is gone from 2.5 minutes to 2. This means you're far less likely to hear the announcement outside Paddington, "We're waiting for a platform to come free." Those faster trains are cheaper to run. An intercity train running on electric mode costs 44% less to run than diesel. Even taking into account overhead line failures, suburban trains in England are an astonishing 300% more reliable post-electrification. The Cardiff Valley lines are undergoing a similar transformation, and they will be similarly reliable once it's built. Also, modern systems are just more reliable. 2019 heatwave, Great Western was one of the only electrified lines in the UK not to have delays. However, there's more work to do. We never reached Swansea, but I hope this will eventually be electrified, creating faster, more reliable journeys. This can be linked to Swansea Metro and other metro projects like North Wales. The effect of fast, reliable services could be transformational. If we can link this to a rolling programme of electrification, we can create more seats, more reliability and reduce CO2. I'm going to finish here, so let me introduce you to Michael. However, please remember to join the chat, and if you can afford, please donate using the button below. But without further ado, the Right Honourable Michael Portillo was a Member of Parliament for 20 years in all, and a Minister for 11 years, including Transport. For some time in the late 90s and early noughties, he was my local MP. Michael has become a broadcaster and amongst many projects appeared weekly on the BBC satirical politics show This Week for more than 16 years. For the last 12 years he's filmed railway journeys for the BBC, which I think you will all know him for. He's covered 5 continents so far with the show, and a new series is planned for this year. So, I will now pass you over to Michael Portillo.
Noel, good evening. Thank you so much for your speech, which I really enjoyed enormously. And thank you too for bringing a sartorial touch of class to our proceedings this evening. Thank you too for making it so painfully obvious to our audience that I'm a man with an enormous political future behind me. May I say how pleased I am to be involved with Wales Week in London, and actually how grateful I am to Furrer and Frey for inviting me. Actually, how pathetically grateful I am to Furrer and Frey for inviting me, for plucking me from the obscurity in which I normally now exist. Had you invited me 15 years ago, my name was habitually in headlines. But I think my name has appeared only once in a headline in the last decade. And it was running up to the last general election. There was some speculation that a cabinet minister might lose his or her seat at the general election. And so the headline appeared, "Will there be a Portillo moment at this general election?" Now, for those of you who don't know what a Portillo moment is, it is journalistic shorthand for a man eating a bucket full of shit in public. Because in the 1997 general election, in the full glare of national publicity, I lost my seat in Parliament, lost my ministerial position, lost my chance of leading the Conservative Party, all gone in one humiliating moment. And that humiliating moment was subsequently voted by Channel 4 viewers and Guardian readers their third favourite moment of the 20th century. And in that poll, I narrowly beat into 4th position the assassination of the Romanian President Ceausescu, an achievement of which I obviously feel very, very proud. But some people have said to me, how was it that your political career ended in catastrophe. And in the intimacy of our little gathering this evening, I'm very happy to take you into my confidence. When I had that seat in North London, which I think Noel referred to, it's apparently where he lived, it was my habit on a Saturday to go to the constituency to a bazaar or to a fete. And one week, standing by the tombola, there was a lady who said to me, "Mr. Portillo, would you please send me a signed photograph of yourself?" Which I thought was a very natural and very understandable request. But to tell you the truth, I forgot all about it. And I wasn't back in my ministerial office until the following Thursday. I used to work quite a short ministerial week, sort of John Prescott of my day, I suppose. And when I got to my office on the Thursday, I went in, and there lying on the table was a letter that had already been opened. It was from the lady. She said, "I met you at the tombola on Saturday. Please don't forget about the photograph." It was signed Enid Snooks. And in brackets, she'd written horseface. I hope none of you is laughing. I was moved. I thought, this is fantastic. Here is a lovely lady with a self-deprecating sense of humour. And this is by way of a challenge to me. She wants to see, do I have a sense of humour? Can I rise to the occasion? And by the most amazing chance, fortuitously, I had on my desk, of all things, a photograph of myself. And so I took my pen out and I wrote on the photograph, "To my very dear Horseface, with very best wishes from Michael Portillo." I popped the photograph into the tasteful matching frame that a Michael Portillo photograph comes in. I put it into an envelope and sent it off to Mrs. Snooks. And I felt great about the whole thing. Then later that day, my personal assistant came in. She said, "Did you see that letter from Mrs. Snooks?" I said, "I did. Wasn't it marvellous?" She said, "I'm so relieved. I thought you might not even remember who Mrs. Snooks was." I trust that it was helpful that I wrote Horseface after her name in brackets. So that, I think, probably explains to you my political career. Noel told you that I think it's now 13 years ago, we began to make great British railway journeys. And we began to make it using a Bradshaw's guide dated 1863. This has now become something of a bestseller. I have a copy of it here. This is the facsimile, but I should explain that I use an original 1863 guide, and it's a very, very, very precious book. So the very first day we were filming 13 years ago, we met at Paddington Station because we were going to travel indeed on the Great Western Railway for our very first journey. I was handed the precious, antique, unique copy of the Bradshaw guide. I fumbled the pass. The Bradshaw tumbled onto the concrete floor of Paddington Station and split into two. For the rest of that journey, I was able to hold the book together, and so the viewer couldn't see that it had been split in two. But since that day, I have never been trusted with the Bradshaw's guide. And so we now employ a sort of 21-year-old who looks after the book, is responsible for the book, and only hands it to me at the last minute before I appear on the camera. And as soon as I finish with the book, it is snatched back very, very greedily and put away in a box for safety. And the box that is used is a children's lunchbox, and it is decorated with Thomas the Tank Engine. So I'm followed around everywhere nowadays by a young person clutching a metal tin illustrated with Thomas the Tank Engine. Inside is the Bradshaw. And there's a certain symmetry to this in my life, because for many years when I was a minister, I had a red ministerial box, which is a very beautiful thing. I'll show it to you here. There we go. You see, it's embossed with E2R, the initials of Elizabeth Regina. And so for many years, I was followed around by a young civil servant clutching my red ministerial box. Now I'm followed around by a young TV worker clutching a Thomas the Tank Engine box. So that early experience of shattering my Bradshaw occurred in Paddington Station, and we've already heard reference to Brunel. So Brunel builds the Great Western Railway, but there comes a time when the railway has to be completed, making a diversion from close to Swindon in order to connect through to South Wales. And it did this, of course, by going via Gloucester. So the GWR was known in those days as the Great Way Round, because it was such an enormous deviation to have to track up the Severn on the English bank and then track down the Severn on the other bank, eventually reaching Wales on the far bank. But even so, the journey could not be done by rail completely until Brunel had built the Chepstow Bridge over the River Wye. I only came across pictures of this bridge when I was thinking about what to say this evening. The Chepstow Bridge, the Admiralty demanded that it have a 300-foot span and that it have a 50-foot clearance. It was going from cliff on one side to non-cliff on the other side. It was a very tricky piece of engineering. Brunel built a substantially wooden bridge. Absolutely extraordinary. Sorry, I've got the wrong bridge. He built a tubular bridge. He built a tubular bridge because it needed to be self-supporting, because it was going from a cliff on one side across the river to an area where there was not a cliff on the other side. It's actually one of Brunel's rather ugly bridges, but nonetheless a piece of engineering genius, because the tubular structure of the bridge gave it strength, but also gave it the possibility that it would be light. So the Great Way Round continued, and of course the Great Way Round demanded a solution, and the solution was the Severn Tunnel, which Noel has also talked about. So he mentioned that work began in 1873, but in 1879 they hit what the film that we're going to see describes as a great disaster, which was that they came across the Great Spring. So an underground spring. They had understood that there was going to be water, that they were going to have to pump water out, but they had not anything like the capacity in the pumps to deal with the Great Spring, because the Great Spring was delivering something like, I've heard various estimates, either 50 million litres of water a day or 63 million litres of water a day. I suppose actually it varies to some extent with rainfall and so on. And this was an immense engineering challenge and struggle. In the end, they built a shaft 29 feet in diameter, and at the top of it, they built a pump house, and they put in there 6 enormous pumps that were capable of pumping out this enormous quantity of water. But it very much delayed the tunnel. During the film, you'll hear that there were delays of a year here and a year there. And so actually, it actually opened only on the 1st of December, 1886. And the film, made in 1959, describes it still as being one of the great engineering achievements of the previous century. One of the reasons for building the South Wales Line, by the way, was the idea that there would be a transatlantic traffic from Fishguard over to New York and the other ports of North America. So that was one of the reasons why it was felt to be very important to complete the line and to reduce the journey time. That is a trade, of course, that never really came to anything. We've already been talking about Swansea this evening, and at Swansea, Brunel had to do something else, and this is where I was getting confused a moment ago. Brunel had to cross the River Tarway so that his railway could connect to Swansea and connect to the West Wales Line going from Swansea further west. And this was an extraordinary construction. This was the substantially wooden bridge of 37 arches, half a kilometre in length. If you haven't seen pictures of this bridge, which was opened in 1850, It's well worth looking it up. And I believe that there's a model at the Swansea Museum Collection Centre, in fact, a model I think that was made in the 19th century of that absolutely magnificent bridge. Oh, my Bradshaw's has something to say about all this, because as you may know from the television programme, I proceed by looking up quotations in my Bradshaw's Guide. And it says of Landor, we've been talking about the Landor Viaduct. Here passengers change carriages for Swansea, 2 mile distant. The view that they obtain here of the valley down to Swansea is very striking. If at night the lurid glare from the countless coke ovens, if by day the dense clouds proceeding from hundreds of chimney stalks overhanging the valley, and at all times the arsenical, sulphurous vapour filling the air, and which you may both smell and taste, give the scene a character scarcely to be seen elsewhere. So a remarkable sight, although described as arsenical and sulphurous, not exactly a healthy environment. And that brings me really to the point that, of course, the railways assisted the industrialisation of Wales, and in particular of South Wales. One could say that without industrialisation, and possibly without the railways, that Wales might not exist at all. And if that is a shocking assertion to you, you have to think that really before the Industrial Revolution, Wales was a principality of villages. It did not have cities, and it certainly didn't have a capital. And with the arrival of the railways, the coal which has always been there, the coal which has actually been dug for centuries, becomes vastly more important and vastly more exploitable. In the 1830s, fewer than 1,000 people lived in the 2 Rhondda valleys. By the end of the 19th century, that fewer than 1,000 had reached 100,000. I'm pleased to say that some Welsh people got very rich on this. Probably the most remarkable example of someone who made an absolute fortune is David Davies. He's also known as David Davies of Llandinam. He made his fortune from railways, from coal, and from ports, from docks, because it was his idea to develop Barry Port, which was a superior port to Cardiff for coal exports. Well, his money, which was really an extraordinary fortune, passed eventually to his 2 granddaughters, Gwendolyn and Margaret Davies. And they were very remarkable women. They were very religious, they were teetotal, they had an extraordinary sense of public duty. They felt that they had really been put on earth to make good use of the fortune that they had inherited from their grandfather. They were devoted to culture and to the arts and all things Welsh, I might say. But one of the things they did was to collect Impressionist paintings. So they would travel to France. They were well known to and by the Impressionists, by Renoir, by Cézanne, by Monet, and so on. And they bought up those paintings at prices that strike us as very reasonable. They weren't buying them at a snip. The Impressionists were already pretty well known by the time these women were buying them at the beginning of the 20th century. But they built up a collection, and they left 260 pieces of art to the National Museum of Wales. And many of you will know that in Cardiff today, we have a collection. The collection of the National Museum of Wales was transformed by the Davies sisters. And actually, it represents one of the great collections of Impressionism anywhere in the world. And many people would be surprised to discover that one of the great collections of Impressionism is to be found in Cardiff. Now, I'm interested in politics, and it strikes me that the railway from England to Wales linked up 2 countries which had very different outlooks. Wales was non-conformist. It tended to vote Liberal, but actually it was politically radical. It had its own language, of course. It had been conquered by the English. It was kept in check by the English. The magnificent castles of Wales were a reminder to a Welsh population that they had been conquered by English military might and that they had remained subjected by English military might. So these two countries are joined together, and Wales becomes vastly more important economically because of its great industrial strength. But with its radicalism, industrial strife in Wales occurs very frequently. In August 1911, the Llanelli railway riots occur. Striking workers blockade the station at Llanelli. They prevent the trains from arriving and passing through. The government in London sends the army to sort this out, because I think for about 48 hours the station is blockaded. The army on the spot panics. It starts firing into the crowd. 2 young men are killed by the army's gunfire. I think they're both actually bystanders. I think they're not even participating in the riot. In the further trouble, the army is then told to put down its weapons, but in the further trouble that ensues, some of the rioters set fire to a railway wagon. It turns out the railway wagon contains detonators. The carriage explodes, and another 4 people are killed. So I think a death toll of 6. It struck me as remarkable that this very severe response to the riot, sending in the army and shooting people, it struck me as very odd that this could happen when there was a Liberal government in London. And indeed, one of the leading figures in that Liberal government was a Welshman, David Lloyd George. David Lloyd George was to become the only Prime Minister of the United Kingdom whose first language was not English, because his first language was Welsh. And he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, and a very notable one. His 1909 budget may be the most famous budget that ever occurred in history. And if you think there was an overreaction to the riots at Llanelli in 1911, it might help you to understand that the Home Secretary at the time in that Liberal government was a man by the name of Winston Churchill, who tended to be pretty belligerent and pretty bellicose. So Lloyd George, this great Welshman, would go on to be Prime Minister, taking over the Prime Ministership during the First World War, in the middle of the First World War. And at the end of the First World War, there's a general election, and Lloyd George continues to be the Prime Minister, even though he's leading a coalition which is by the vast majority made up of Conservative members of Parliament. So there's this anomalous situation that a Welsh Liberal is leading a coalition government that's mainly made up of Conservatives. And the Conservatives become fed up with Lloyd George in 1922. They eject him from 10 Downing Street. Lloyd George has nowhere to go to live, and he actually comes to this house, the house from which I'm talking to you now, the house where I live with my wife, is the house where Lloyd George came to live in 1922. And although I've lived here 11 years, I've only just discovered that this is where Lloyd George came to live. And I discovered it from the diaries of his mistress, Frances Stevenson, who records in her diaries that she'd been to see David LLG, as she puts him, David LLG, in a poky little house in Vincent Square in London. And I'm speaking to you now from Lloyd George's poky little house in Vincent Square in London. I would say that Welsh railways have another very important place in British political history, and that is a bit earlier than what I've just been talking to you about. In 1900, there is a railway strike, and following the railway strike, the Taff Valley Railway Company sues the union officials personally, makes them personally responsible for the losses that the railway has incurred as a result of the strike. It goes to court, of course, and the court finds in favour of the railway company, so the union officials are responsible for paying the costs of the strike. And this, of course, is catastrophic for unions. How will they ever be able to organise another strike if they're to be held personally responsible? And one of the things that that judgment in court leads to is the idea that the working man must be represented directly in Parliament. Going through the Liberal Party is no longer any good. And so the Labour Representation Committee is formed, which becomes a party which fields candidates. By 1906, the Labour Representation Committee has 29 members of Parliament, and they put pressure on the Liberals to introduce legislation to reverse the Taff Valley Railway decision. And the Labour Representation Committee is, of course, the origin of the Labour Party. And so we have Welsh Railways to thank for the Labour Party. And may I say how very warmly I want to thank Welsh Railways for creating the Labour Party. Well, let's come to the present day and your own achievements in electrifying the railway line. I must say I find it very extraordinary that until now, the capital of the United Kingdom and the capital of Wales have not been joined by an electric railway. And I can say from my travels that I think this is a most exceptional position in Europe. The amount of electrification in Britain lags very far behind most of Europe. As an example, an extreme example, I grant you, but the Swiss decided to electrify in 1902, well over a century ago. By 1936, 70% of Swiss railways were electric. And I think today the number is 100% in Switzerland. Our own figure, as I understand it, is 38% of the rail network. And according to Knoll, 8 percentage points of that 38% are accounted for by the railway that you have just electrified. But it remains the case that there's very little electrified in Wales, outside South Wales. And as we know, and as Noel mentioned, on the South Wales line on the GWR only as far as Cardiff. There's nothing on the GWR beyond Chippenham, heading west through England. There's nothing apart from suburban services between St Pancras in London and Sheffield. There's nothing in Scotland north of Edinburgh and Glasgow, and there's no electrification at all in Northern Ireland. And I say from my Bradshaw perspective, you know, Bradshaw was a cartographer who started to map railways in the early part of the 19th century, and then he became the person who spotted the possibility of creating a railway timetable and then published these guidebooks. And Bradshaw drew enormous pride from the fact that Britain was so far ahead with the Industrial Revolution and was the first country to have intercity railways. And I think actually that Bradshaw would be pretty disappointed that Britain now lags behind in things like electrification and things like high-speed railways. But that is all the more reason to congratulate those of you who have been involved in this electrification. And the last prop I have today is a glass of champagne. Well, actually, it's Spanish cava, if I'm completely honest. But I would like to congratulate you and to drink a toast to your great achievement, which has indeed been a very, very difficult one. I'll say one more word about that in a moment. But as you can probably tell, I'm coming towards the end of my remarks. I just want to, reflect a bit on my life, if I may. I entered politics, well, for the first time, I suppose in 1979. I was responsible for briefing Margaret Thatcher before her press conferences in the 1979 general election, the one that first brought her to office. And then I served in Thatcher governments and the Major government. But my life has been a game of two halves, really. So there I was working for Margaret Thatcher in the old days. Now last few years, I've been making documentaries on various subjects. Recently, I found myself making a documentary in the Kalahari Desert about meerkats. Are you familiar with meerkats? Cute, the meerkats, would you say? Actually, they are dictatorial little bastards, these creatures. Because what happens is that in any group of, say, 20 meerkats, a dominant female emerges. And this dominant female handbags her way to the top. She may drive the other females into the Kalahari Desert, where they may well perish. She may insist on eating the other pups of the other females, the pups of the other females, to establish a monopoly on breeding. And then, gentlemen, an extraordinary thing happens. The testosterone level of the dominant female rises, and the testosterone levels of all the males in the group fall. And this has led me to a much more thorough understanding of Margaret Thatcher's governments than I had ever had before. Noel was very kind at the beginning to mention a program that I did for more than 16 years. It was called This Week. It was a satirical show on the BBC. It was on very late at night. For 16 years, it largely consisted of a Labour MP called Diane Abbott and me sitting on a sofa together that was far too small for us. And what many people didn't know was that Diane and I had been at school together. So naturally, we had amassed a certain amount of emotional baggage. And so there we were, week after week, in the middle of the night, crammed together on this tiny sofa, surrounded by our emotional baggage. We knew that no one was watching. And in those circumstances, we became quite tactile. So I quite often would put my arm around Diane and give her a bit of a squeeze. She would sometimes rub my right knee. And we did audience research, and we discovered that our audience was 50% insomniac and 50% pervert. And I just want to thank the many of you here today who were regular watchers. That is the end of my remarks, except now to introduce the film. So you've heard already that the film is called Under the River. It was made in 1959. It's a remarkable documentary. The voiceover is very much of its time. It's very clipped, rather pompous sounding. The director was an R.K. Nielsen Baxter, who'd been born 50 years before. He made other documentaries of the sort, one called The Great Highway, one called Inland Waterways. So two things in particular struck me. One is that the struggle that they had with the water in the Severn Tunnel back in the 1870s and 1880s has been mirrored by the struggle that you have had electrifying the tunnel all this time later. The opponent of nature, the force of nature, is the same, and it has proved to be, I think, a much bigger task than you thought, just as it was a much bigger task to construct the tunnel in the first place. So I think those who've chosen this film tonight have chosen very, very well. It is very, very apt. But the other thing I was talking about how Britain did not electrify, how Britain stuck with steam and so on. And one of the things that struck me about this film is that already in 1959, this film is dripping not only with the Great Spring, but dripping with nostalgia for the steam age. Already in 1959, it's dripping with nostalgia for steam. And I think I would argue that it's that national nostalgia that has held us back. And with that thought, I give you Under the River.
Okay, that was an excellent video. I'm Rob Daffin, and I'm here to collate some of the questions and pass them on to Michael and to Noel. So we've got quite a good mixture of questions, and I'll go with them in a random order, I think. So the first one, probably this is for you, Michael. Rail patronage, this is from Paul Tetlaw. Rail patronage has been really hit hard by the pandemic, and people have got the impression that it's unsafe perhaps to go on the train. Messages have contributed to this, and many people have taken to their cars instead, which is obviously much more dangerous. What now?
We don't know what now, but of course, I very much hope that we'll go back to where we were. You will know as well as I do, when I was Minister of Transport in the late 80s, there were 700 million passenger journeys on our railways. And before the pandemic, there were 1.7 billion passenger journeys on our railways. So an increase of 1 billion, much more than a doubling. And in the 1980s, we had kind of assumed that railways were in terminal decline. So that was a very unexpected result. Even though, of course, car ownership went up enormously in that period. So I suppose one of the contributors was congestion, people wanting to get away from the roads. But also, I think that the railway companies were offering what people wanted, in particular fares, although the fare structures are condemned for being very complicated. The fare structures have been pretty good at filling up trains, because we know that anyone can fill trains normally, in the rush hours, in the morning and the afternoon. But the business of railways really is how do you utilize your trains during the day? And the fare structure has been pretty good at attracting people onto trains so that they are filled up more across the day. So I kind of think that that this pattern will resume. And I kind of think that before too long, we'll be talking again about problems of undercapacity, talking about the need to develop high-speed 2 and how we're going to have longer trains and longer platforms and so on. I think we will get back to all of that. I do think that the negativity has been vastly overdone. I was particularly horrified by a message that was broadcast, I think, in stations around July or thereabouts. It had a voice that said the person speaking was suffering from motor neuron disease, and went on to say, "Thank you for not traveling today and risking my life." I mean, what an extraordinary message to give out, that if you were traveling by train, you were in danger of killing someone else. And I do think that the railway companies entered into the business of telling people not to travel on their railways with greater enthusiasm than I'd often seen when they were trying to promote people travelling on their railways.
I'd agree, yeah.
And I do reflect that, of course, for the railways, to some extent, it's been an ideal position, because they get their money from the government. And the one nuisance about running a railway is the passengers. The thing that makes trains run late is passengers. So they've had a rather ideal situation, no passengers and lots of money. And that mentality absolutely has to change. So I'm very sorry when even today, traveling by railway, I hear announcements that say, the government has told you to stay at home. I cannot wait for these messages to be reversed and for us to be talking again about the things that matter, which is, quality journeys, reliable journeys, and the environmental impact. By the way, I've continued to travel by train in this period. Luckily, I'm allowed to travel to Leeds up to twice a week to do a programme on Channel 4 in Leeds. And one day I didn't make it, or I just made it to the programme, because there was an accident on a level crossing and all the trains ceased to run. And I thought the argument for new high-speed lines, in my view, has been misstated. The argument is for reliability, because we have 7,000 level crossings. The railway can be put out of action at any moment by a cyclist or by a bad driver. One of the things about new railway lines is they don't have level crossings. They have very high levels of reliability. And it's back to my theme, we are relying on a Victorian infrastructure, and then we're surprised when sometimes it's not as reliable as we'd like it to be.
Agreed. Thank you. Another more future-looking question. This is from Nick Snell, and this is a question to both of you, really. Feel free to choose who wants to answer. I guess maybe to you first, Michael. This is from Nick Snell. What about a new electrified rail tunnel between Great Britain and Ireland?
Well, here you might be pushing at an open door because Boris, I think we all know who Boris is, the Prime Minister.
He likes a big project.
He likes big projects, and he seems particularly interested in connecting Great Britain with Northern Ireland, and it's kind of one of his union projects. I don't know whether it would be an electric railway. I suppose it would have to be, because it doesn't really make much sense to build a tunnel with diesel propulsion. But on the other hand, I have already mentioned that there is no electrification in Northern Ireland. And by the way, Northern Ireland is on a different gauge as well. So a rail tunnel is by no means a straightforward project, because I suppose you'd actually have to build the railway from the tunnel to Belfast. You'd need a new railway that was electrified and that was standard gauge. But a tunnel of some kind, I think, probably is coming.
Makes sense. Noel, do you have a view?
Yeah, I mean, I think technically it's probably feasible with enough money, having looked at recent projects like the tunnel between Denmark and Sweden. Yeah, these things are buildable. Whether there's more pressing issues, personally, perhaps I would think so, than building a new tunnel. But yeah, we'll see where the connectivity review that is currently underway goes.
Thank you. Another question for Michael from Peter. So in Great British Railway journeys, you stayed overnight in some amazing places. Are there any that you really loved and have returned to since?
Oh, now let me think about that. Beautiful places I've stayed in Britain. I've stayed, I'm not sure how many names I'm going to remember straight away. I think my favourites have been places that were mentioned in Bradshaw's that were in those days stately homes, and which since then have become hotels. And there are quite a lot of those. I mean, one that just comes immediately to mind, because it has a jolly good story around it, is one just outside Aylesbury. Is it called Hartwell House? And it's a lovely place to stay. It was a stately home. And its distinction in history is that after the French Revolution, obviously Louis XVI was beheaded. We've only recently discovered, this sounds crazy, but through DNA, we've discovered that Louis XVII, his son, was killed at about the same time, very shortly afterwards. So the fellow who was Louis XVIII stayed at Hartwell House during the Napoleonic Wars. We put up the French king. And so he lived there, and it's a glorious hotel today. I must say I have been very lucky, stayed in fantastic hotels, and I think in particular of, thinking abroad now, I think in particular of, I think it's the National Hotel in Moscow, where Lenin stayed during the revolution, or I think of the Mandarin in Bangkok, where I had a suite which had, I think, 12 rooms. I more or less gave up trying to count how many rooms I had. I am a very, very lucky person.
I think people are busy making their holiday lists as we speak. Back on the more political one here from Mike Gillard. Michael, what do you think? The government are forecasting to spend roughly 100 billion in the next 10 years, but only about 2% of that in Wales, whereas about 5% of the population live in Wales. Discuss.
I think it's a very good point. I'm quite worried about the distribution of the money, and the government obviously is committed, it says, to levelling up, but the levelling up seems to have quite a political aspect to it. That is to say, levelling up mainly in the red wall seats, and those seats, as you know, are in England. So I think there is a problem with that. And beyond that, you know, you look at railway, just sticking to railways for a moment, you look at railway services in and around London, and they're pretty good. And when I go elsewhere in England and Wales and Scotland and look at suburban rail services in Northern Ireland, Some of them are quite shockingly bad. So I think the money isn't very fairly distributed at the moment. I suppose the lesson that should be learned from the red wall seats is that in a place where a lot of seats suddenly go conservative, a conservative government will be very happy to spend a lot of money there to hold the seats. So Wales, I think you get the message.
Thank you. One on hydrogen now. I'll go in your direction first, Noel, and then we'll have one more question afterwards, conscious of time. What do you think about the hydrogen economy? Is hydrogen a threat to rail electrification? Grant Shapps seems to like his hydrogen trains.
Yeah, I think the government are keen on it. It makes for good PR. I do think hydrogen has its place. Network Rail, who manage the infrastructure in the UK, have already published where they think should be electrified, where they think should have batteries and hydrogen. So, and some parts of the country with low passenger numbers, I think will eventually have hydrogen. So it's not a bad thing. But for mainline railway, for busy railways, it's not really feasible. The physics of a hydrogen train limit it, and if you are running trains on like the rest of Midland Main Line, hydrogen's just not really a long-term option. So yeah, hydrogen has its place, but electrification for particularly the vast majority of the UK railway, if the UK's goal is to decarbonise.
Thank you. And same question to Michael. Have you been on a hydrogen train, maybe?
I think I went on a prototype somewhere. I know almost nothing about this, so I'll just make a couple of irrelevant comments, as politicians generally do. So one is a reflection that I've often made during my years of making these railway programs, that it is quite extraordinary that, propulsion apart, the technology of railways is completely recognisable 200 years after they began to today. So the basic structure, which is metal wheels on metal rails, is the same as it was at the time of the Stephensons and Brunel. And I can't think of any other technology where it can be said that what was happening 200 years ago is still recognisable today. On the propulsion side, I mean, one more word about Brunel. He wanted an atmospheric railway and he nearly got it. He nearly got a railway to operate on atmospheric pressure. He couldn't make the tubes airtight. But what a genius that man was. And on electrification, although I'm celebrating the work that you've done on electrification, it does seem to me that overhead lines, strike me as rather old-fashioned. They're quite vulnerable. They're things that come down in snow and wind. They're things that at least, theoretically can represent a danger to the public. And I can't help thinking that something new will come along. Maybe it's trains that take electricity from some system below the train rather than above the train. But I think possibly one way or another, we are nearing the end of the era of catenary. I just really wanted to use that word.
Thank you. And the last question to bring it to an end on a lighter note, Oliver Wilson wants to know, where do you buy your blazers?
If you want the literal answer to that, I buy my blazers at a place called Volpe, Volpe, which is very close to the house where I'm sitting now. It's in Denby Street. There we are, a good Welsh name, Denby Street, in London SW1. And yeah, it has been one of my pleasures to wear outrageous clothes over the years. It's become a kind of growing joke. And some people comment that it's not so much, the colours I wear as the colours I wear with each other, the contrasts that strike them as very odd. It may help you to understand that I am in fact colourblind and normally get dressed in the dark.
Thank you. So I'll pass you back to Noel. I'm afraid nobody's interested in your blazer, Noel, but I'll hand back to you.
That is fine, Rob. I only wore this to having told you not to dress too smart for this evening. So Yeah, I just wanted to finish up by saying, yeah, thank you everyone who has attended. Obviously, thank you to Michael for speaking and being kind enough to answer questions. If you haven't donated and can afford to, please, press the donate button below. I know the Railway Benefit Fund would really appreciate every pound anyone can donate, and so would everyone who is supported by them. 3 last thank yous. Yeah, thank you to the British Film Institute for providing the film and agreeing that we can show it. And thank you to Orchard, who are managing the IT for us and the IT architecture you can see around us. And the last thank you is to Wales Week, who've been great in hosting us. So yeah, please check out the rest of the website. There's still a few more days of Wales Week and a few more events. And thanks, Rob, for the questions. So yeah, have a great evening, everyone, and thank you for dialing in.